Keith, thank you very much. Greetings to all 151 of you who are still with us at the end of this long but incredibly productive day. Greetings from Boston College, as we move into this final session of the summit. So we have just one guest in this final session. That's Achim Steiner. Achim is a person who has worked for 3 decades for sustainable development, climate resilience, and international cooperation. Since 2017, for the past 4 years now, he's been the director of UNDP. Before that, he spent a decade, from 2006 to 2016, as the director of UNEP, the United Nations Environment Program. And in the year between those 2 UN posts, he was the head of the Oxford Martin School at Oxford University, which focuses on developing solutions to the 21st century. The Oxford Martin School are the publishers of that extraordinary online data resource, Our World in Data. I can't tell you how many times I've turned to that myself. And I had the privilege a few years ago to work with you, Achim, when we were both co-authors along with Keith and about 40 of our other closest friends in putting together the Lancet Commission on pollution and health. So it's a pleasure and it's a privilege to have you with us this afternoon. So as we move into this last session, as we think about what do we do next, let me take just a minute or two to summarize with all of us where I think we are. So we're in a time of unprecedented global change, of a whole interlinked series of challenges to planetary health. Climate change, as we've been discussing all day, is moving along. And in its wake come global warming and storms and droughts and wildfires, and then migrations and wars. Pollution in all its many forms is killing approximately 9 million people per year. We're losing species at an unprecedented rate. We've come to understand that these are not isolated, unrelated crises. These are all linked. A root cause that ties them all together is greed, short-term thinking, reckless extraction of the world's resources without concern for cost or consequence, obsessive focus on the GDP without taking account of human capital or our natural capital. We also know that all of these crises have a whole series of direct and indirect effects on human health that we've been talking about here today. But on a more positive note, we've come to realize that a focus on health, that talking about the health consequences of climate change and biodiversity loss and pollution gives us a powerful tool to explain to policymakers, explain to our brothers and sisters in the health professions, to explain to the general public why climate change, biodiversity loss, and pollution matters. I think that when people understand that these planetary threats are not just somewhere out there and far away, but rather that they're here and now, and that they're affecting people's health and children's health today, it gives us a powerful vehicle for leveraging change. And so I think it's in that theme of how do we best leverage change and close the gap from theory to policy that would do these final 20 minutes of this session. So that's my short screed to open us up. Now let's get into the fun part, which is the conversation. So, Achim, I'd like to start with asking you a question about climate change. As the director of UNDP, you're directing the organization that's probably the largest supporter of climate change under the Paris Agreement. Could I ask you 2 questions here? Number one, what are the trends you're seeing? And number 2, what gives you hope?
Well, Philip, thank you very much. And let me also thank the consortium. It's always a pleasure to join a group of people who are promoting joined up thinking, and particularly in the context also of academic research and policy making, but as you have also all alluded to, in that interface between what's happening to our environment and how it directly affects how we as human beings are faring on this planet. So for me, this is a conversation that, you know, whether it's planetary health, public health, and climate change, I mean, these are the intersections that I think are a reflection of the moment we find ourselves in. And that leads me directly to answering your question. I think we all share a growing sense of desperation about a very simple phenomenon, but one that is deeply troubling. We have begun the countdown to the moment at which we cross a point of no return when it comes to 1.5 degrees. Now, science already, and in some quarters, members of the IPCC think we may have already passed that point on the 1.5 degrees, but let's assume for a moment that, you know, somewhere in T-9, the year 2030 is, in a sense, a moment in time after which it is almost delusional to assume that we could still do enough to stay within a trajectory that allows the world to catch up with what the science has been telling us we need to limit carbon emissions and greenhouse gases. So I think that sense of desperation is growing, which is, I believe, something that more and more people are not only sensing through the science of climate change, but in fact through the existential experience playing out before their very eyes. These last 24 months, these last 6 months in terms of natural disasters playing themselves out, living through a pandemic that in part is linked also to that relationship between humans and environment, I think we are in a profoundly transformative moment in terms of an appreciation of what it means to live in the age of the Anthropocene. I use that term without wanting to delve deeper into it. Now, I can understand many people, particularly younger people, who at that moment become angry and frustrated. And I think there is a growing sense of frustration and helplessness. And the latter is actually the more dangerous. Frustration itself is not a bad thing because it makes you more alert. It starts getting you to answer and rather ask deeper questions, searching questions. It's a sense of helplessness. And against that, I would offer the following, not just out of a kind of idealized optimism. If you just look at the last 24 months, in the midst of a pandemic without precedent almost in terms of living memory, what we've actually seen happening on the climate action front is really quite remarkable. It's more than we would have hoped for, not expected, but hoped for just 2 years ago. If we were sitting and having this discussion October 2019, I don't think anybody would have predicted an 800 billion euro Green Deal, a European Parliament endorsing a 55% emissions reduction, a US administration that reverses the exit from the Paris Agreement, and I could go on. India with 480 gigawatts of renewable energy coming on stream by 2030, and the story goes on. What we are witnessing right now, a few years ago, would have seemed revolutionary in terms of actions on climate change. Against the backdrop of this T-9 countdown, however, seems inadequate. And I think in that sense, I continue to hold a sense of optimism that the world is going to increase rapidly and exponentially its actions on climate change, but we are getting damn close to the precipice.
Thank you. Chilling, but still optimistic, so important. Let's talk about nature-based solutions. What role do you see for nature-based solutions in the current situation?
No, I sometimes go back to this extraordinary sense of technology and science becoming the defining variables of progress and almost of human life and existence on planet Earth towards the middle and end of the 20th century. We actually thought that science and technology would, in the sort of tradition of development, make you less and less dependent on nature, make us independent of nature. And here we are in the most technologically advanced, scientifically knowledgeable moment in human history, and we're actually thrown back into a fundamental realization that no amount of technology or science will make us live autonomous from nature. Life support systems are fundamental, however sophisticated our time might be. And yes, perhaps a few billionaires are beginning to create that notion that we could all move to Mars or to the moon. But for the majority of us, unlikely to be an option in the near future. So let's go back to a very clear realization. And that one is lagging behind the climate change awareness, because right now there is actually the biodiversity COP that was happening in Kunming. The world is not yet focused sufficiently on the extraordinary loss of biodiversity, and therefore our ability to understand how we can connect responses to climate change with biodiversity conservation, with a more sustainable management of natural resources, a restoration of elements of our ecological infrastructure on the planet is fundamental. And that is one reason why I often plead with many of our colleagues in our fields of work, let us also use the Sustainable Development Goals, because frankly, there is no way we can try and save biodiversity in one track and then try and deal with climate change in another, and then figure out how people, have enough to eat, access to electricity in another. This is the age of combining the design for a development intervention, for an investment, for a technological advancement with its both individual and public good utility. And that is why I think the SDGs are still being underestimated as an agenda that allows the world to come together, but also for us to actually address these issues, not in parallel, but by leveraging off one another.
Thank you. So we are, the Consortium of Universities of Global Health is basically an organization of public health professionals of universities committed to public health. And I think, although we just heard Dermot Campbell-Landrum a few minutes ago talk about the optimistic trends in the health professions dealing with climate change and the other crises of our age, I think it's fair for me to say as a physician myself that until very recently, the health professions haven't really been very prominent in this whole process. And yet when I look back 40 or 50 years, I can think of previous instances in which the health professions were right in the lead and became powerful influences of policy decisions. And my favorite case study is that of the IPPNW, the International Physicians for the Prevention of Nuclear War, which had such powerful influence approximately 50 years ago in backing the great powers away from the brink of mutual nuclear destruction. So I wonder, as we move into the last few minutes of this conversation, what advice can you give to us in the health professions? How can we step up? How can we make a difference?
Well, Philip, I think the fact that there is a consortium, that there are people in your profession who have begun to, in a sense, organize a way of thinking about these issues is already the first step. This is a critical stepping stone towards, I think, a medical profession that, let us perhaps be honest, for much of the 20th century was focused very much on that kind of view of medicine as really being related to the ingenuity of human skills in understanding physiology, epidemiology, developing drugs and treatments and so on. And I think undervaluing or underappreciating, perhaps is the better term, the enormous significance of what environment would represent to public health. And WHO still estimates that 25% of all diseases that people die of prematurely are environment related. We still have 7 million people dying prematurely just from indoor and outdoor pollution. And I think the pandemic has demonstrated to us even further how much this sphere of environment and nature out there, as it used to be viewed perhaps in a lecture hall on medicine, and human well-being, human health are related. So to me, the crucial part of it is to bring the understanding of how these two condition each other and how they can also reinforce one another. You have led or been part of the Lancet Commission on Pollution and Health. And I want to actually give the Lancet journal also some credit, because in the last few years they have taken significant steps towards trying to create a conversation around precisely the, let's say, slight inertia in the medical and human health professions to appreciate how much they can contribute to addressing environmental pollution, destruction, and harm to human beings, and thereby become part of a voice that we ultimately need to make the kinds of shifts that are necessary. And I believe that whether it is on climate change, whether it is on pollution, on chemicals, on pharmaceuticals, the link also between pesticides and herbicides and human health and ecological health. These are not topics that belong to ecologists when it affects a bird species or a frog species, and into a medical lecture room when it affects human health. This is the continuum, and the best way that I think I can perhaps end this is to look really at the cycles, hydrological cycles. What is at one moment an agriculture production enhancing treatment, namely a pesticide, into the soil, into the water, into the hydrological cycle, and ultimately into the water tap and faucet and the human body. We have enough examples of the kind of chemical pollution. There are conventions such as Basel and Rotterdam conventions that try to address this issue of how much our science and technological advancements have really become also liabilities for human health in what we carry in our bodies today. And you'd be surprised, which a few years ago I was shocked to hear, that some of the greatest pollutant tracing in human bodies was found in children of the United States and Japan. This is not a poverty phenomenon. This is actually a byproduct of wealth, ignorant wealth, perhaps. So I think making those linkages is not only important from a knowledge perspective, it then allows us also to form the kind of alliances that ultimately persuade, I think, societies that we need to change course, and changing course is possible.
Yeah, I think this artificial separation that I think is probably deep-seated, at least in Western thinking, that the artificial separation between humanity and nature is something we have to overcome. And I think that last point you emphasized about the detection of chemicals in the human body it's a very powerful specific. In the United States, the CDC does a rolling survey across the country each year, taking blood samples and urine samples from a segment of the population, and they routinely detect between 200 and 300 manufactured chemicals in every man, woman, and child in my country, and that includes nursing moms and newborn infants. And so it's very clear that what's out there in the environment gets into us and has the power to change us, to change our children, to affect the health and the well-being of future generations. So this has been a great conversation. I know how incredibly busy you are with the work you're doing at UNDP, trying to shape sustainable development around the world. Thank you so much, Achim. It's been a delight to have you with us, and thanks again. So, Keith, do I give it back to you for the final benediction here?
Yes, please, Dr. Landrigan. And Administrator Steiner, just to echo Dr. Landrigan, thank you so much. We're deeply honored to have you here, and know that at CUGH you have a friend. UNDP has a friend in CUGH. We are committed to collaborating with you and your colleagues as we are across UNEP, your former home, CBD, IUCN, and so many of the other WHO and other agencies working so hard to deal with these two existential challenges that you mentioned. So again, just to echo Dr. Landrigan's comments, we're honored, deeply honored that you've made the time to be with us today. And I'm just going to close it out with a few final words, and what Administrator Steiner really closed off on is we cannot be helpless. We are not helpless. We have solutions. You heard many of those solutions today. And I would encourage everybody to take a look, as I mentioned before, to all of the products being put out by the international agencies and the speakers and the organizations you heard from today. But I think there's a couple of central points that we heard today. One, as Administrator Steiner mentioned, we are sitting at the edge of a precipice. Two existential threats are before us today: the climate change threat and the much less appreciated and I'd say deeply neglected threat, which is the global extinction crisis. 1 out of 8 million species on the planet are threatened with extinction. Many of them will go extinct in our lifetimes. And extinction, of course, is forever. As we're tearing apart the biodiversity network that we are a part of, we are also harming our future. That's our life support system. Is that natural biodiversity network is torn apart, our fate goes with it. So what can we do? Well, one thing we can do is kick the can down the road any further, and all of this in terms of the solutions are in our hands today. So here are a few things that we can do that are actionable, that are doable, and are impactful. First, look at the 30 by 30 target. That's 30% of land, 30% of the oceans are protected. That's a hard target. It'll make a consequential difference in protecting those ecosystems that, again, that you heard are our life support system. Second, look at the International Union for the Conservation of Nature's red list on critical ecosystems. These are a very small, actually, part of our landmass, but they represent a huge part of biodiversity on the planet. And interestingly enough, a large percentage of those lands are actually into the tenure of indigenous peoples, some of the poorest people on the planet. So there's an opportunity to work with indigenous peoples to protect critical ecosystems that have an impact both on biodiversity, and those ecosystems, of course, are carbon sinks. They're the natural carbon sinks that will give back to us, pulling carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, putting oxygen back into it, and it'll do it in perpetuity. Second, as we heard from Dr. Min Savage from Exxon, that they're in favor of a carbon price. Let's set that carbon price at $50 a ton and move up from there. That's a market solution that many people actually approve, and the European Union have actually done a good job in terms of implementing that. Next, end subsidies to fossil fuel companies. That's a route to be able to generate the funds that can be used to support the funding of the initiatives that I'm speaking about today. Dr. Carity Wright mentioned the issue of corruption. Corruption destroys countries from within, robs them from the resources needed to be able to support climate change actions, improve health outcomes, address the social determinants of health, and again, deal with the biodiversity crisis that we have before us. So finally, in order for us to be able to bridge the gap between what we know, what the knowledge we have, and action, we have to get politically active. And as healthcare professionals, I have two hats. I'm a physician, but I was also a member of parliament for many years. I can tell you it is critically important for all of us to get politically active. The public can move the political. If we're not politically active, those solutions are not going to be implemented in the timely manner that they have. So finally, folks, thank you very much for joining us today. Again, I'd like to thank very much Jenna Smith, from our team, who led this effort. She was assisted also by Heather Lawler-Jones from Boston College, Nick Hudson from the University of Pittsburgh, Jim and Catherine at Boston College, the rest of my team here, Dalal and Julia, as well as the many people out there who have assisted in advancing this. I would encourage all of you to join us at CUGH 2022 next March, where we're going to talk about how we actually address both human health, planetary health, and social justice, the core of this symposium and the challenge before us. Thank you for joining us today. We look forward to working with you in the future. Have a wonderful day.